Hello and welcome to the Atlas Agency, where we investigate the Arkham Horror Living card game. Undimensioned and Unseen is the fourth Mythos pack in the Dunwich Legacy cycle. In today's Mythos pack Spotlight, I'll be taking a look at this expansion. I'll introduce each of the new player cards in this pack, and then I'll share some thoughts on the scenario itself. Hope you enjoy! Undimensioned and Unseen contains 11 new player cards. There are 2 cards per class, one level 0 card and one higher level card, except for the Rogue class. This time out it's their turn to get 1 extra card, so they have a level 0 card and 2 upper level cards. And this is the first pack to not contain any neutral cards. So I'm going to dive right into introducing the cards, starting with the Guardian class. Their level 0 card is a 1 resource event called If It Bleeds. This is fast, and you have to play it after you defeat a monster enemy. Each investigator at your location heals horror equal to that enemy's horror value. So as far as healing cards go, this is okay. The fact that it affects multiple investigators is nice, and the fact that it's fast is nice as well. Why I really love this card, though, is the flavor of it. So the fact that you were able to defeat this one monster gives you enough hope to kind of pull you back from the edge, keep you going, and give you the feeling that maybe your struggles against these creatures aren't in vain after all. I think that's awesome flavor, and so I really appreciate this card just from that angle alone. Guardians also pick up a new 2-handed firearm asset. The Springfield M1903 is a level 4 asset that costs 4 resources, comes with uses, 3 ammunition. As an action, you can spend 1 ammo to fight and get +3 combat and deal +2 damage for that attack. It cannot be used to attack enemies that are engaged with you, though. Then it has a combat icon and an agility icon. The bonuses on this weapon are nice, but because of that restriction that it can't be used to attack enemies engaged with you, it really doesn't feel like a natural fit for either of the current Guardian characters who would be able to use this. Neither of them are particularly good at evasion, so you'd probably be relying on another investigator to engage with the monster. I don't know that that's ideal or worth the trouble. Also, in that case, you would probably still need a backup weapon for when you were the one engaged with the enemy, and that would be complicated by the fact that this is a 2-handed weapon. If we get another style of Guardian investigator later on who is not focused on being the primary combat character the way the current ones are, maybe this would be an interesting card for that kind of a character, like maybe a Guardian who's more focused on healing. But for right now, for Roland and Zoe, not extremely interested in this card. A little mini theme that runs through Undimensioned and Unseen is skill cards. There are 4 new skill cards in this pack, and that's as many as there have been in all of the previous Dunwich Legacy expansions combined. The Seekers get a new one called Inquiring Mind. It has 3 wild icons, but it has the drawback that you can only commit it to a skill test if there's a clue at your location. As far as drawbacks go, I think this is a pretty mild one, so I really like this card. Last pack we got the Survivor skill Rise to the Occasion, which also has 3 wild icons, but it has a much more severe drawback. This one, I don't feel like you're going to have any problem getting this card out of your hand. You may end up in situations in the late game where the clues are off the board and you can't use it, so maybe occasionally it's a dead card, but I think the upside outweighs that downside. Expose Weakness is a level 1 Seeker event that costs 0 resources. It's fast and says play during any squiggly player window. Choose an enemy at your location. Test Intellect X, where X is that enemy's fight value. For each point you succeed by, reduce that enemy's fight value by 1 for the next attack performed against it this phase. Then the card's got 2 combat icons and 1 intellect icon. So here we have a crab having its weak spot exposed for massive damage. I like this card. I think it's an interesting support card. Lets you soften up an enemy before you or another investigator makes a big attack with maybe something like a shotgun. It says you can play it during any squiggly player window, so that means you could play this and interrupt another player's turn right before they're about to make their big attack. On top of that, the icons I think are neat too. 2 combat is good, so even if you don't have a big boss that you need to soften up, or if you're just not in a good position to succeed by more than 2, then you could just pitch it for the icons and still get a good use out of it. I bet it would be pretty satisfying to combo this with the skill card Double or Nothing that doubles the difficulty of a test and then rewards you by giving 2 success results if you still succeed. This would let you get the enemy's fight value nice and low before you have to double it to give you a better shot at achieving the Double or Nothing. We haven't had a new Mystic ally since the core set, but here in Undimensioned and Unseen we finally get one. Alyssa Graham is a unique asset, costs 4 resources, occupies an ally slot, and gives you a permanent +1 intellect bonus. She has a fast ability that requires you to exhaust her, and that allows you to look at the top card of either the encounter deck or any player deck. You may then add 1 doom to Alyssa to place the looked at card on the bottom of its deck, and she's got 1 health, 3 sanity, and an intellect icon. I haven't got to play with this card yet, but I do find it interesting, and I'd like to give it a shot, probably in a solo deck as an encounter deck insurance policy. In the past, I've tried to use the card Scrying for that sort of a purpose, and what I found was that since it required an action to activate it, it was just too slow. I didn't have the time to spend an action every couple turns to re-scry the deck. Once you get this one in play, though, there's no cost to looking at the top card of the encounter deck unless you decide that you want to move it. So you can just look every turn and then only use the moving ability when it's a really bad card. The other Mystic card in this pack is a level 4 upgrade to the card Rite of Seeking from the Dunwich Legacy Deluxe box. This new version has 4 changes essentially from the old one. First is actually something that makes it worse, and that's that the resource cost has gone from 4 to 5. It now has 2 intellect icons instead of just 1. It gives you +2 willpower for the test, and if you succeed, instead of getting 2 clues on the old one, you now get 3 clues if it's successful. This is a nice bit of action compression if you're running a clue-gathering Mystic-type character. You get to pick up 3 clues per use. It's got 3 charges, so you could potentially net 9 clues if you're successful on all 3 uses of this. I think that's pretty solid. I feel like the Survivor class has gotten some of the weakest and least interesting cards over the course of the Dunwich Legacy Mythos packs, so it's very nice to see them finally get an interesting level 0 card, and that is Dark Horse. This is a level 0 asset that costs 3 resources. It is limit 1 per investigator, which means that you can have 2 copies in your deck, but only 1 copy can be in play at any time. During the upkeep phase, this card allows you to choose not to gain any resources, and it says that while you have no resources in your resource pool, you get +1 to all 4 stats. So again, I think this is the coolest level 0 Survivor card to have come along since Fire Axe and Peter Sylvester in the Dunwich Legacy Deluxe box. Fire Axe has already kind of shown us that a card that relies on you having 0 resources can still be very, very good. Survivors also last pack got the Scrapper talent, which is another place they can dump money for agility or combat tests if they want to get down to 0 resources. I think that this is going to work pretty well and will probably be a significant piece in a lot of decks. The other new goodie for Survivors is an upgraded version of the Survival Instinct skill from the core set. This new version costs 2 experience points and has an additional agility icon. The old one, if you were successful during the evasion attempt, you got to disengage from all the enemies at your location and move to a connecting location. This new version does the same thing, but instead of just disengaging from the enemies at your location, you get to evade them and then move. This potentially buys you a little bit of time that the original Survival Instinct didn't, because the enemies aren't going to just immediately come after you in the enemy phase. If they have Hunter, they're going to be exhausted for that first turn, so it buys you just a little extra window before you have to start worrying about those enemies again. The original Survival Instinct is sort of a blind spot for me. Survivor's probably my least played class, and I don't think that I've ever actually used the original Survival Instinct. Looking at this one, though, I think this is probably fairly viable. I tend to run at least one mass evade effect when I do a Survivor, like normally that's Cunning Distraction. This one, though, does not cost the 5 resources that Cunning Distraction costs, so I feel like that's a pretty big benefit to this. You do have to pass a test, whereas Cunning Distraction's automatic, but Survivors are pretty well equipped to succeed at those tests, and this is going to give you +2 to it anyway. So I think I'm going to end up trying to run this, and at 2 experience points, that's not too bad. One more thing, this makes the level 1 card Fire Extinguisher from Miskatonic Museum look really, really bad. Quick Thinking is a rogue skill with a single wild icon. It says if this skill test is successful by 2 or more, after it resolves you may immediately take an action as if it were your turn. This action does not count towards the number of actions you can take each turn. I'm a sucker for free actions, so I really like this card, and I imagine this will be an auto-include for most of my rogue decks from here forward. If this had just worked during the investigation phase, then I think it still would have been good, but the fact that you can use it on any skill test means you can potentially get actions during other players' turns or during other phases. And anywhere where you've got a skill test, you have the potential to squeeze in an extra action. I think this is going to really reward clever play for players who can really think through a situation and figure out how this extra action out of sequence could help them to do something they wouldn't ordinarily have been able to do. So again, I'm really a fan of this one, and I'm looking forward to using this. I have already had one of these eaten up by an autofail token, though, so that was a real bummer. I'd pitched it to an easy investigation test, counting on getting an extra action, and sure enough, autofail and no extra action for me. The second rogue card is Lucky Dice. This is a level 2 asset that costs 2 resources. This is the game's first exceptional card. Exceptional means 2 things. Number 1, it means that the experience point cost of the card is twice its level. So while this is a level 2 card, it actually costs you 4 experience points to buy it. The reason that that's different from the card just being level 4 is that it works with the deck building restrictions. So if you have a character who is only permitted to take up to level 2 rogue cards, like for example Wendy from the core set, they're still eligible to purchase this card, whereas if it were just a straight level 4 card, they would be locked out of it. The other thing that Exceptional does is it restricts you to only purchasing 1 copy of the card for your deck. So the pack does come with 2 copies of this card, but each character can only use 1. So back to the card, it's got a reaction ability that says after you reveal a chaos token, spend 2 resources to ignore that token and reveal another one to resolve. If that token has an autofill symbol, remove Lucky Dice from the game. So what this does is allow you to pay 2 resources to retry any token pull. And also, if you don't hit the autofill token, then you are allowed to use this card more than once for the same test. So you can spend 2 resources to try another repull, again, as long as you don't run into that autofail symbol. I think this is a neat card. It sort of feels like what I'll call a dessert. By that I mean this is probably not something that you're going to buy early on. Since it's exceptional and you can only have 1, you can't really depend on it. So it's not, I don't think, going to form the cornerstone of any strategy. But once you've got yourself set up with the important cards that you bought with your experience, this is something nice to get, I think, with the experience that you have left over. So you get your upgraded weapon, you get your, maybe your streetwise, whatever the cornerstone of your strategy is, and then you come along and scoop this up later on when you're not sure what else to get. Rogues also get a new upgrade to the skill card Opportunist from the core set. The original Opportunist contributed 1 wild icon to the test, and it said if you succeeded by 3 or more, you got to return it to your hand after the test instead of discarding it. This new version costs 2 experience points, still only has just the 1 wild icon. The only change is that the threshold to return the card to your hand after the test has been lowered from 3 to 2, so now if you succeed by 2 or more, you get Opportunist back. I'm underwhelmed by this card. We've seen on some other cards that 2 experience points seems to be the standard price for adding a card draw to another effect. For example, Lucky level 2 just adds a card draw, or the level 2 version of Emergency Cash adds a card draw. Opportunist's effect is kind of comparable to a card draw. If it succeeds, you get a card. It's just always going to be the same card, Opportunist. So to pay 2 experience points and have it not be guaranteed maybe feels like this is a little overcosted. If I'm looking for a wild skill, with a single wild icon, probably would just prefer to have Quick Thinking out of the same pack instead of Opportunist. That's the end of the player cards. Let's talk about the scenario. Now, Midnight Masks from the core set is still one of my favorite Arkham scenarios, and the best part about Midnight Masks is the way it gives you a granular, non-binary measure of success, where you don't just pass or fail at reaching a specific outcome, but instead you get to see how well you do on a scale. Undimensioned and Unseen is the first new scenario to really try a Midnight Masks style granular objective again. How well does it work this time? Well, overall I found this scenario to be enjoyable, but I do feel like it doesn't quite execute that granular objective thing quite as well as Midnight Masks did. I'm going to talk about a few of the things I liked about this scenario first, and then I'll circle back and go over a couple of negatives. I think the biggest strength in Undimensioned is that its enemy encounters have a very unique feel to them, and that's thanks to a couple of scenario effects that put twists on some of the basic enemy behaviors. So your approaches to both avoiding and fighting enemies will be pretty different from normal most of the time in Undimensioned. Those changes give this scenario a lot of its identities, so that's something I really appreciated. Another thing I like about Undimensioned and Unseen is the way it delivers some small flavor and story moments in a way that feels a little different from normal. So the Arkham LCG does this unique thing where it sometimes blends flavor text and game text, and that blending is used a lot in this scenario, and to really good effect on the location cards. As you explore the map, you find these little mini-stories that are embedded in the location's game text. I really enjoy these on my first playthrough. They liven up some ability text that might otherwise have felt a little bit repetitive across the locations. And the other location abilities that don't use that blended style of flavor text still get good thematic explanations for their effects in the normal flavor text. So those touches definitely elevated the immersion in the scenario for me. So those are what I think of as the two highlights of the scenario. Let's go into some negatives. So I said before that I don't think Undimensioned executes the granular objective style quite as well as Midnight Masks did. There are a few reasons for that, but the one I want to touch on here is the one that annoyed me the most, and that's that getting a perfect outcome is sometimes, but not always, just a little outside the player's control. So players are after a certain set of goals here, and the scripted parts of the scenario don't always get all of them into play. So that can leave you needing to draw a specific encounter card in order to have a shot at getting a 100% or a perfect score. So I had at least one solo game where my investigator was ready for the last goal and pretty well equipped to finish it, but basically had to sit and twiddle her thumbs hoping to draw an encounter card that would start the action. And eventually I ended up just having to go resign when it became obvious that it wasn't going to happen in time for me to be able to act on it. That's more likely in solo and maybe two-player play where you're drawing fewer encounter cards overall. It's just sort of a minor annoyance, but I found it fairly bothersome just because it would have been so easy to avoid. The design could have easily had some way for players to draw out one of those goals on their own. Even if it was something difficult, I think that would leave me feeling better about the way it works overall if that was at least an option. The other negative I wanted to mention is a balance issue, and that's that the difficulty of this scenario probably really swings based on your investigator. The scenario favors one stat really heavily for a portion of it and kind of prevents you from shifting the burden onto one of your other stats in its place. So certain characters are just going to be naturally well equipped to deal with this one, and then there's at least one investigator who I really would not want to run through this adventure. Overall though, despite those few annoyances, I still found Undimensioned and Unseen pretty enjoyable. I would rate this one towards the middle of the pack as far as the released Dunwich scenarios. This is probably number 4 out of the 6. Coming in under Blood on the Altar, which I think is still number 1. Close behind the 2 scenarios from the deluxe box, and it's a little better than Miskatonic Museum and Essex County Express, I think. And that's it for this video. As always, thanks for watching. For more Arkham content, visit our blog at atlasofarkham.wordpress.com and also subscribe to this video series. Thanks!